There are so many things that once you really start investigating in that market and you start talking to your potential prospects and customers there, that you might uncover certain realities that you could not have anticipated. I don't think that's something that, at least to my knowledge, you can fix with AI.
Welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast, where experts discuss international content management, product localization, and global expansion. I'm Caterina from Undertow. We create and manage localization programs for B2B SaaS companies so they can grow globally. Today, our founder Nicola Calabrese will be talking with Sjeel Koster, a fractional CMO with deep experience guiding startups and scale-ups through different stages of growth and international expansion. Sjeel has developed a 5-step strategy marketing expansion playbook that helps companies enter in new markets with clarity, structure, and focus. In this conversation, she shares her approach to building a solid foundation before expanding and designing a minimum viable go-to-market strategy. They will also discuss how localization and product marketing play a crucial role in adapting to new audiences and maintaining brand consistency across markets. So, without further ado, let's dive in.
Hi, Sjeel, and welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast. How are you today?
Hi, I'm very good. How are you doing? And thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's really great to have you here. And we're going to talk about international expansion, go-to-market, how that changes. But before we jump right into the conversation, would you mind introducing yourself a little bit? Tell us about your journey so far.
Sure. So now you can call me a fractional CMO. I've been doing that for the past 2.5 years. But before that, I was working for various different hypergrowth tech companies. One of them called Lightspeed. I worked there for 7.5 years. I was the 16th employee when we got acquired by Lightspeed. And when I left, we were 1,300. There, I really learned how it is from going from startup to scale up to corporate, going IPO and doing various M&As across Europe. So learning how to work hard is really what happened at Lightspeed. After that, I worked at EVBooks as the right hand of the CMO. It was more the strategic hand in terms of like performance and growth and marketing operations. There we focused more on enterprise accounts and bigger deals. And after that, I started my own company, Holiday Hero. I did that for 2 years. We built it from the ground up, from 0 to 1. So what makes it unique, I think, is my journey from 0 to 1 and from 1 to 10 and from 10 to 100. And that's why I work as a fractional CMO, because I can really help all the startups and scale-ups in various phases that they are entering to help them for the next step of growth.
It's quite a journey, I would say. And as I said, we're going to talk about international expansion. So now, obviously, everybody has AI, it makes everything easier. So now it's just, if you want to go into a new market, you just need to click a button, you get a website translator, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
You don't need to do everything else, right?
Exactly. That's it. That's
so we can close, we can go home now.
Yeah. There are no jobs for anybody anymore. No, I think it definitely speeds up the process, right? I think if you looked at it like 5 years ago and you were having a WordPress website, for example, and you needed to localize to the German market, you always needed to work with like a translation agency, freelancers, or anything similar to that. And right now, tools like Framer, for example, or Webflow or WordPress have plugins that you can just toggle on, and then it is automated translations, right? Which of course speeds up the process, but there's still some manual work involved with checking the copy and making sure that the translations make sense, because there are a lot of nuances for specific markets and also specific words that you might use in specific regions that don't make sense in other regions, right? So I think it definitely speeds up the process, but I think there's still some nuances in how quickly you can actually localize and what is needed to properly localize.
Yeah, and more in general, when you decide to enter a new market, like there's several things that you have to keep in mind. It's not just, let's say, the website copy. So there's different things. What do you think will be, if you were to do some kind of checklist or a list of things to keep in mind, what would you think about first?
I think what happens a lot is that people or companies are like, oh, okay, it's going well in the US or it's going well in the Netherlands. Let's just localize or let's just expand to a specific market. And the thought is there, but the approach to it usually is lacking. So the approach that I usually have to this is like 5 different steps. So I call it the 5-phase strategic market expansion playbook. I actually just wrote about it also on my Substack. And the first step in that process is strategic foundation and market entry planning. So that is really the foundations that you need to have in place as an organization to make sure that you can actually scale to another market, right? And there are a lot of things that you can think about. It can be like product readiness, legal and regulatory requirements, anything from making sure that internally your team is really ready, and also scoping and understanding the markets where you want to enter into. So how big is the market actually, and how big is the potential? How much competition do you have in that specific market versus others? And then based on what are you going to prioritize that market over others, right? So, and I think that there are actually a lot of questions that you need to ask yourself before you do that. And once you've done that step, then you usually go into minimal viable go-to-market development. And this is also a topic that I really like to talk about, because with minimal viable go-to-market development, what you're doing in your core market is really understanding, do we have a repeatable motion that we can rely on? And do we really understand and see the repeatability in that motion, which we can then potentially copy over to new markets, right? If you don't have that repeatability, then first and foremost, it doesn't make sense to even expand. So that's the core basic part that you need to have ready. And then once you have that, then you can understand, is this motion also the right motion to copy over to a new market? Or are there certain adjustments that we need to do that are maybe better? For example, if you know that there are a lot of local partners in Germany that you can leverage as resellers to test out the market prior to expanding with a huge budget and resources, maybe that's the first way to start testing it, right? So what is the minimal viable go-to-market motion for your next entry market, and how are you going to test that? Then the third step in the strategic playbook is localization strategy and resource planning. And this can be anything from how are we going to localize and what are the processes around that? What are we going to do with AI? Are we okay with AI translations? I mean, I've seen a ton of companies that are just doing AI translations, and then I come to the site as a Dutch native person, and then I'm reading it and I'm like, what is that saying, right? But some companies are completely fine with that. That's okay. I mean, if that's your strategy and you want to do it, like, that's fine. But it's more about the alignment on what are the standards that we're working with? And then also, what are the resources that we need to allocate to make this happen, right? Sometimes it's just like, oh, let's just use the existing team that we have and just put a few freelancers that can accommodate the localization there. But you need to make sure that you have budget allocated to that, and that you also make your team aware that this is going to happen, right? So there's some processes and there needs to be some strategy in place before you can start executing on that part. And then the fourth step is execution and early validation, right? So the execution part is like the execution around the minimal viable go-to-market motion. And the early validation is this actually working? Are we getting that repeatability in our motion so we can really see if this is the right market for us to enter? And also at a certain point, maybe say, this isn't working. What do we need to change? What do we need to adapt? And then once you have that repeatability, then you enter the fifth phase, which is around scaling and optimization. And I'm talking a lot, so I'm sorry, but
No, it's okay. I will ask you then to drill down a bit in some bits and pieces, because, for example, in the third part, when you say like the localization part, obviously we're really interested in that. And one of the things that I'm curious about is because you said like some companies just go with AI and they're fine with that. But sometimes you need like a different approach, and depending on the kind of, let's say, of touch point and content, you might need a different approach and workflows. And that's something that needs to be thought of. And what do you think about that and the ownership of the, let's say, of taking into account like localization? Somebody needs to own that. And if you're entering more than one market, how would you recommend like going about that? If it's better if it's one person, several people, because there's the balancing between global brand, local adaptation.
Yeah, it depends a bit on how big your team is, right? If you're a startup and you're already scaling that quickly and you're going into many markets at the same time, then usually what ends up happening is that marketing has most ownership of the localization, and maybe product also has some ownership of the localization of the product, right? And then there's a split in the localization budgets between the product and the marketing teams. But it really indeed depends on the size of the company and how you're organizing that. But I think that as a CMO, you really need to take a stand and challenge the teams on what localization actually means, and then agree on the level of localization that you're going into. And I didn't write about that part, but I think there are multiple levels of localization. But it's just about agreeing what good looks like for your company.
Yeah, and I guess especially when you're in different markets, it makes sense. Like you should recommend dividing in tiers. So you have like most important markets, and there may be others that need, let's say, more limited experience for different reasons. Imagine you're going into the Nordics. Let's say, for example, English is, let's say, more tolerated than, let's say, Germany. So you can like scale back a little bit there, the localization, and invest more in Germany that needs to like some more adaptation, maybe with different pain points that need to be addressed.
Yeah. Indeed, or you have local partners that can take on the localization for you, right? So sometimes, at least at my time at Lightspeed, we had some local partners where we would just give them the English variations of our product brochure and all of these things, and they would just localize it so they could enter the market for us, right? So there are many ways of approaching it, but it's just about the alignment and the internal agreement on how you're going to localize and who's responsible for what.
And when you were talking about the phase 4, when you're basically validating the initial experience, the initial go-to-market motion, how do you think it can be set up some goals that are realistic, but at the same time will give you an idea, like, are we on the right track, or maybe we need to change something?
Yeah, that's quite difficult because usually what happens is that you just copy what you have in your core market and you apply the same rates of conversions and targets, but then you adapt it for the new market, right? And what I'm also describing in this article is that you usually cannot calculate with the same budgets. You cannot calculate with the same conversions. You cannot calculate with the same cost per lead because you're entering a new market. You are most likely working with sales teams or sales reps or partners that are still in a steep learning curve of understanding how to sell your product and how to speak the language of the market, right? And make it work. So yeah, there it's really about what is like setting the bare minimum of the expectations, right? But I don't think you can measure on the same levels as for your core market. And what those minimum levels should be, I think you can work with your RevOps specialist or with your CFO on what that can be. What a good starting point is, of course, looking at your ideal customer profile in that market and mapping your serviceable addressable market there. And let's say if you go to Germany, you first want to launch in Berlin because you have high density in Berlin, then you can map that and see how that is going, right? And have a very clear guidelines on what the conversion rates ultimately should be and how many deals you want to close by XYZ. So it's more about setting some internal benchmarks that have a minimum rate that you would be okay with from more of a financial perspective.
Sorry to interrupt your listening, but do you want to grow your B2B SaaS in international markets? Because every country is different, and what users value in one market doesn't necessarily matter in another one. At Undertow, we help B2B SaaS companies like yours succeed in their international expansion. We create customized localization strategies that address the unique challenges of each market. In this way, you can effectively attract, engage, and convert customers worldwide. Visit undertowlanguages.com to find out more. And now back to the show. Going back to the beginning, when you're figuring out what to start from, where to start from, what are usually the things that you see that are most often, let's say, underestimated or completely overlooked?
I think it's more about like the whole executive team or founding team or management team should be aligned on what market expansion actually means and what each team is responsible for. Because before you even start thinking about marketing or localization or translating your website, your product needs to be ready for that, right? So usually it starts with understanding if your product is actually ready and what market you want to start penetrating. And I think that usually there are a lot of assumptions about what markets you should enter. and validating like why are we going into that market versus other markets, and based on what decisions are we going to make that decision.
And when it comes then to the, let's say, the final step, the scaling up of the efforts, what do you think there is something to keep an eye out of, or any kind of general recommendation you would give to make sure that you build on a solid base, and how do you scale that up properly?
So I think the most important thing is around really seeing that repeatability in your motion that you are betting on for that market. If that isn't working, optimize it, and then still set specific timelines on for how long you're going to do that, right? Because each month that you continue doing this, it's an investment in resources, in time, in budget, all of these things, right? So it's more of that internal alignment again on what is the clear no-go in our go-to-market motion, and when are we happy with the results, and when is it maybe the time that we say, this market isn't flying, this isn't working, we need to maybe do something else, or we need to maybe kill it. And I think that those are important conversations to have. If you see that something is working, then of course you need to double down on it. And then you're going to have more conversations around, okay, it's clearly working. How can we now scale this? What are our ways to potentially scale it? And what are the other stuff that we need to do from a localization standpoint to really get this market to the next level? Yeah, I think those are mainly the things. And maybe one last thing that I can also say about that is like, if you have defined your repeatability in that specific motion when it comes to market expansion, document it, right? And take your learnings from that so you can potentially use it when you go into a next market, because then you have somewhat of a process of, okay, we're going to start testing it in this way. And that's a lot easier than to start from scratch again when you want to go into another market.
And related to that, like, would you recommend, do you have a rule of thumb, like, let's say just one market at a time? Is it okay to do several markets in some specific cases? Do you have a general rule, or it really depends on the company?
Oh yeah, it so depends on the company. And this is actually also something that I'm talking about, because there are so many ways to expand, right? At my time at Lightspeed, we had a very aggressive M&A strategy. So we just bought companies across Europe and we expanded in that way, right? And then you can discuss, do we need to have that framework that Sjeel is suggesting us to use? Doesn't make sense for a company at the scale of Lightspeed, right? We had enough resources and we were localizing by buying companies, literally. In my time at EVBooks, they had a very aggressive reseller and distribution strategy, right? So we worked with a lot of local partners and resellers that could take our content and translate it for the markets that they were selling into. And that also worked in a specific way. And then more of the pressure lies into what our resellers are doing and holding them accountable rather than the internal teams that we have, right? Because the localization is not as big of the strategy that we're doing with the marketing team itself. And then at my time at Tescorilla, for example, we had a capture everything strategy. So when they also had I think an investment of 70 million. Well, if you get 70 million, you can do a lot with that. And you can test a lot of markets at the same time and then see where you're getting traction. So again, that framework that I was just discussing might not be the best approach there, because you want to scale quickly and you want to just see what works. And there's not a right or wrong in that. It's more on, it really depends on your capital and what the expectations are from your VC or PE and the approach that you want to take. I think the model that I'm discussing is more for the companies that maybe don't have that amount of resources, that maybe don't have that natural multi-market traction, or that maybe don't have high enterprise type of clients, because usually, let's say you sell to enterprise clients, there are only maybe 500 across the globe. And of course you need to localize then, because it's like enterprise. So you go hyper-personalization ABM, so you need to localize almost. So yeah, it really depends on the situation, what fits. But I think for most companies that are following the generic growth path without any weird circumstances that I was just describing, or weird or cool circumstances, then you really, if you are at that point that you're like, okay, we're hitting a little bit the growth plateau in our current region. We know that we have tapped into most of our serviceable, addressable markets. We have captured 80% of the market. We're reaching almost that point. Let's prepare to go to expand into a new market. And then it's really the time to look at the 5 steps that I was discussing.
When you talk about, like, for example, relying on resellers, local resellers, how do you, like, any recommendation how to balance the fact that, where you might lose, let's say, control of the brand if you're, let's say, delegating it all to the resellers? How do you balance that with centralizing the brand and having, like, the resellers, obviously they need to adapt because they have specific needs in the market that they know better than the central, let's say, company?
To make this work, you really need to have very good product marketing in place, right? So all the nuances around your software product need to be very clear. You also need to do maybe some first steps into understanding the market nuances in working with your resellers and adapting a little bit your playbooks to that. So no, the core fundamentals will always be with the HQ, right? But once you have the documents ready, then you will send it over for them to either translate it or use it in the English language based on what they think might work for their clients, right? Or their accounts that they are tapping into. So the responsibility of the localization, you leave that with the reseller, but the boundaries around your brand, around your product positioning, around how you talk, that lies with you.
Okay, so it's still like finding a balance and coordinating heavily with the local resellers. Yeah, it's a good, let's say, a partnership, yeah.
Yeah, and I think at Aqua Blue, for example, we have a huge reseller network now in Europe. So we work with a lot of different languages. There, we, from an HQ perspective, are now working on the localization of our core website, right? Because we know that the clients of our resellers might enter our website, so it needs to be localized. But when it comes to like our marketing in a box package, all the assets and tools and branding materials, we give it to them in English, right? But we give them the assets so they can also localize it themselves when they need to. But there are very clear guidelines on how to do that. And we also make sure that from a channel marketing perspective, we are checking the levels of localization, right? Or we checking the levels that they are aligned with our brand guidelines. So yeah, of course, there's a certain check in place. We don't give them all the freedom to just run with it without any guidance.
And when it comes to budget, do they like share budget with them, or do they do with their own budget? How is it they're established?
Mostly it's part of MDF, so market development funds. So localization should be, I think, allocated in your market development funds, unless you say this is something that we want to take completely in-house and have a localization agency firm for, because we just want to do that and have the responsibility within the company itself rather than putting that on the resellers. If you're expanding into markets very quickly, it might be just the best way to do it in that way, because not all markets require that heavy localization.
And you mentioned also like product marketing. So how do you see the role of product marketing changing now, especially when it relates nowadays with all the changes that are happening, plus in relation to international expansion specifically? If you see it different and how?
I think product marketing plays a very pivotal role in understanding the market that you're entering. So, for example, what we did at Female X Finance, they were entering the UK market or preparing to enter the UK market. So before we really did that, the two founders went to London and they had various conversations with their target audience and partners and all of these things to really understand, are there certain nuances that we need to take into account? They recorded all the conversations. They brought it back to me. And then I analyzed it with AI and I looked at it, how it compared to our current positioning that we had in the Netherlands. And there were some very structural differences that we needed to adjust to. Even our way to expanding in the UK should be slightly adjusted. Sometimes it's even informing you to change your pricing slightly, right? So it's super, super important that from a product marketing perspective, you are prepared to go into that market and that you adjust your product positioning, because you might have different competition there that you don't have in the Netherlands or that you don't have in the US. And all of a sudden, that competitor is maybe very much on the same line of your features and the way that they are positioning themselves in that market that you want to enter into. So you need to really think about all those elements as a product marketer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as well, if it's really the market maturity is quite different from where you're coming from, and then might need to shift a lot of things as well around content as well. You're gonna publish more educational maybe, or more like about the specific use cases. And is there anything else that you think like that we didn't mention, but you think we should talk about related to international expansion, the role of marketing nowadays, or any new trend that you see coming up that might affect the way things are done or will be done in the future?
Well, I think that's the topic around the role of product marketing and making sure that a product marketer investigates the market a little bit from like a product marketing, product positioning standpoint. How do we differ from the competition in that market? And understanding how our product positioning frameworks need to be adjusted for that market. And then also with that, our complete messaging, right? Maybe the homepage needs to be slightly adjusted, or industry-specific landing pages, or our sales deck, or our pricing needs to be slightly adjusted for that market. There are so many things that once you really start investigating in that market and you start talking to your potential prospects and customers there, that you might uncover certain realities that you could not have anticipated. And that's where I think that anticipation, once you have those conversations, you're like, yeah, we need to do something with this, right? And it's very, very valuable for everybody in the organization to be aware about that before you enter a market. So I think that is something for me that is really underestimated in a lot of organizations these days. And I don't think that's something that, at least to my knowledge, you can fix with AI.
Yeah. And the other one that I see as well, sometimes underestimated, is after, let's say, the initial launch, the feedback that you get from not only sales teams, obviously, but also customer success and support, because they speak with the customer after the sale happened. So they have sometimes like feedback that is really useful to adapt the whole experience, not just the, let's say, the pre-sale experience.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and those are also things that you can track, right, with Gong or with other tools that you can record like the conversations and then analyze it and use it for like your adjustments in your product positioning, or it informs your product roadmap. Like all of these things are super helpful. Yeah.
And what you mentioned about the like taking all the feedback, all the conversations, and then comparing it with your current positioning, is it something that you've done like with, let's say, with ad hoc tools that you created, or with prompts that you created, or you use like a specific platform or a feature within a platform that you're already using?
No, it's not a specific product that I use for that. I just have a specific template on the questions that I asked in the Netherlands. And then you're trying to find the nuances in what is happening in the UK. And then you see the differences. So you just ask the GTP or cloud, like, can you come up with the differences in our current positioning framework and all the feedback that we've gotten from the UK market? What are the nuances that we need to keep in mind? And then usually there's like this whole list that rolls out of it because you have all the transcripts from the conversations that you had. Yeah.
Okay, no, yeah, that's quite interesting. Yeah, a way to use AI. There's always like new use cases for that.
Yeah, no, it's just taking the conversations and just analyzing it with AI and just asking the right questions and prompts around product positioning.
Okay. And is there any like specific channel where people can find out more about what you do, get in touch if they want to reach out? Any channel that you prefer?
Yeah, LinkedIn, I think, is my core channel. You can reach out to me there. You also see weekly posts coming up. And of course, my own Substack, which I only launched a month ago. But yeah, I'm sharing a lot of insights around different things around go-to-market expansion, ICP, what that actually means, building a go-to-market GPT stack, a lot of different subjects that could be interesting for the listeners. So yeah, feel free to follow me.
Okay, yeah, that sounds really good. We'll put those in the show notes so people can easily find them. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us today. The Multilingual Content Podcast is powered by Undertow. We help B2B SaaS companies grow in any language. Get in touch if you want to know more. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episode. If you want to support us, remember to give 5 stars to the podcast. See you next time.